Welcome, everyone, to Stepping Into Your Leadership. I'm your host, Christine Courtney. Our goal here is to give you some actionable takeaways that will help you lead your teams. Thanks for joining us on this leadership journey. Let's get started. Hello, welcome to Stepping Into Your Leadership. I'm very excited to welcome back to the studio today my friend and colleague and all-around amazing inspiration as a person, Blonka Winkfield. Welcome.
Hello.
I invited Blonka today because we're tackling a tricky subject. We're tackling this idea of executive presence, or sometimes we call it leadership presence. A lot of times people are like, I don't know if I have it. How do I get it? What is it? It's a bit like a holy grail of what is that next step in someone's leadership. And so I wanted to kind of tackle it today because we do get so many questions about it, especially from folks who are trying to climb that corporate ladder and someone has given them the feedback at some point that, oh, you need to work on your executive presence or your leadership presence. And then they're kind of like dumbfounded as to what that means for them to actually do. So we're going to try to dive into that a little bit today. And I invited Blonka here because when I think about that idea of leadership presence or executive presence, Blonka is one of the first people that comes to mind for me, because if you've ever had the pleasure of having her walk into a room that you're in, the room changes. She has that kind of energy. She pulls a focus, but not in a negative way, in a very positive way. And you feel, the way I describe it, Blonka, I've never told you this before, but when I first moved to New York City, I was an actress in New York City many, many decades ago. And I was going to my first acting class in New York City, and I was walking down the street and I felt this whoosh, right, walk by me as this man walked by me. And I was like, what is that? And he had like a big, I kid you not, big black duster coat and everything. And I went, who is that? And I looked around and it was Lawrence Fishburne. Okay. And I was like, wow, like I am in New York. So you have like a version of that yourself when you come into a room or into the office, or, and you and I've talked about this because it's a superpower that can be used for good or evil, right?
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
But anyway, you have this. So I invited Blonka to talk about it. And before we jump into it, I just wanted to give some general definitions. And Blonka, if you have a differing one, I kind of was looking up, like, how do you define this? Because so many of the questions people have is like, what does this mean? What code do they mean by saying this? And so anyway, when I looked it up, basically it's saying that executive presence is about developing a blend of skills, behaviors, and attitudes that enable you to command respect, inspire confidence, and motivate others. And there's things that you can do to develop it. Now, I've read other people's versions of a definition of that, which can mean being your authentic self, but in the most confident version of your authentic self. There's lots of different, but that's hard for people to know. Wait a minute, how do I get that? It's hard if you're 25 years old, 30 years old, and someone says to you, we want to put you in a leadership role, but you need to work on your leadership presence or your executive presence. And then the hard part is that we don't want to act in that moment like we don't know what that means. And so we just go, okay, good note. And then we go away going, what the heck? And then I inevitably get calls from people saying, I got to work on this. And I'm like, well, what do you think they mean by that? And then they, we don't know. So we kind of dig into it. So Blonka, what do you think? I mean, I gave you some definitions that are out there. What do you think? What does it mean to you?
I mean, I think that's a pretty spot on definition. I definitely think it's the ability to be in a room and have a certain kind of energy that people are attracted to or pay attention to, as you said, in a positive light. So whatever that is for you, because it does delve a little bit into the person that you are, bringing what that innately is for you, but also knowing the room that you're in and how to work that room in a certain kind of sense. Because it's great, the authenticity piece, but who you authentically are may not work in every single room if you're looking for people to feel like you have a leadership presence or an executive presence.
Yeah. And that's always what's so awkward, is because I think that more and more young people today are saying, well, we should be able to be ourselves anywhere we go. And I mean, they're not wrong. In a perfect world, that's true. And we hope that the world catches up with that. What we kind of know as women of a certain age, that the world isn't always there for you in the way that it should be. And that there are things that you can do to adjust maybe in the moment that can help you to get what you want.
Right.
And so if you're listening listening to this as a younger person saying, no way, I should just be able to be you're right. You're absolutely right. Here's your right prize. And I guarantee you, if you have other folks of our age or older or men or anything in the room, there are things you can do to get what you want, to be
Yes,
a little more strategic
exactly.
in how you do it. And then the world hopefully will catch up, or you can be one of those people that changes the world and, does it, right? So, but today we're going to talk about some things for those of you who are struggling with this or have maybe some anxiety or questions of like, how do I do this? We're going to try to give you some actionable tips at the end of today's episode to help build this in yourself, because I know that I've had to do that, especially, Blonka, like you said, in rooms where I feel I don't belong, or I have some sort of imposter syndrome coming over me, or where I just immediately, or in rooms where I have imposter syndrome take over and it starts to lessen my confidence,
Right.
and I start to become someone that I don't even recognize anymore, right?
Yes, yes.
Like there are places where as a 50-something-year-old woman, I can go into my office where it's my staff, where I've been running that, and I can feel pretty confident. I can have a certain amount of leadership presence. But, I went to a international business conference a number of years ago, and boy, did I see it come clear how my leadership presence just dwindled in the face of me going, I don't belong here, in my head going, I don't belong here. These people are so much more qualified than me. What am I doing? I just want to be wallpaper,
Right.
and sure enough, that's what happens. No one notices you. It's a cycle that you create. I created that I see happening. And so in that moment, I could have used some of those tips.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have the same thing. As a matter of fact, Tatiana and I went to a superintendent's conference years ago. I think we were in Denver, and I had that exact same feeling because I can go to conferences anywhere. Usually there's a lot of teachers or other people who are in my very similar position. But that superintendent's conference was one that was very heavily white male, older dominated. And you walk into a room and that presence that you normally have that works, I was like, oh, this has got to change a little bit. Like they're looking for a different kind of thing. Half of what they're looking for, I can't be in the first place just because of innately who I am. However, there's still things you can do to move you in that direction where people actually see you and you feel confident about being seen in that room.
For those of you who are first-time listeners, Tatiana is our producer. I'll just give her a title, executive producer
of the show.
She's like, wow. But anyway, she's one of our producers. And so, but I'm just curious, Blanca, were you able in that moment to recognize what was happening and do something about it while you were still there, or was it later?
I was able to up it a little bit while I was there, but it definitely is one of those moments, as you said, you kind of shrink into yourself. You're like, oh God, oh God. And then, I think the first like couple of sessions with people, it was that manner. Then you kind of go, okay, looking at the room, what do I need to do? How do I stand out? And then for me, it's normally in a room where you're looking to have some kind of leadership presence. The best way is to quickly become almost the smartest kid in the room in a positive way. So if you're, being in a session with them, look for a question that you can ask that almost know the answer to. Give that question some feedback or some advice. And then people turn around, they look at you, they go, oh, there she is. Oh, that was a good question. And that immediately takes your confidence up and then also boosts the confidence of the people in the room about you. So that's one of the things that I do when I'm in a room and I have that kind of feeling like, not sure where I fit in or how, I'm coming across in this moment. Sit back for a second, observe the room, and then feel out, okay, I fit in this way. So it's not being fake, but it's feeling out how best you fit in that room and how do you feel confident in that moment, putting forth something a little bit different.
Yeah. And that's a great example of a place where your confidence comes from, right? And you were able to tap into that. It's funny because if you work on your self-awareness, you'll recognize this stuff faster, right? For me, unfortunately, when I went to that international conference that I was talking about, I didn't really recognize what was happening until afterwards. And then I was like, oh, that was really a wasted opportunity. I still learned a lot.
Yeah.
I still was a learner. I just didn't make the impact that I would have liked to have made in some situations. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if I was to handle it now, I would prepare a little bit differently. So yeah, definitely think about for yourself those moments when you feel like you've had that kind of leadership presence and moments that you haven't.
Right.
And like, what was the difference that you noticed in yourself, right? What is the feeling that you noticed? There's a lot of people that have tackled this subject as of late. One of my favorite folks is Amy Cuddy. She has a fantastic TED Talk on it, and she talks about those power poses.
Mm-hmm.
She's the one which we'll talk about in the tips, because but she says that presence is about approaching our biggest challenges without dread, executing them without anxiety, and leaving them without regret. And I thought, wow, if I could have had that presence or that frame of mind when I'm struggling or when that imposter syndrome starts to take over, what a difference my life could be. So,
Yes,
it's not always
sure.
perfect, but there are moments where we're like, dang, I was good then,
Yeah.
or I had the room, or you can feel it. And that's if your self-awareness and self-regulation is working. That's when your emotional intelligence is getting sharper
Yep.
and better. You're going to have a better opportunity to really have that presence grow, right? And not have that imposter syndrome or that anxiety or that dread take over.
I think that's one of the things with younger people. They don't necessarily, not saying that all of them, don't want to offend any of the younger listeners, but they haven't necessarily developed that self awareness. And so it's harder for them to figure that out in the moment in a room, because mostly they're very into being authentic, which is great. But you have to have a self awareness that goes along with that. That is my authentic self serving me in this moment. And so I think that's one of the things where they have a little bit of a harder time grasping this kind of concept, because they're still growing in their self-awareness. I'm 55 and I'm still growing in it every single day. And usually that self-awareness piece that we're talking about when it comes to leadership or executive presence comes much later, because a lot of it comes through your work experiences and being able to put this into practice. They've had less of that. So, it's one of those kind of things that I think it's hard for them to figure it out, because it's about practice as well.
Absolutely. Practice, practice, practice. If you want to hear more on your authentic self and on where we did episode 16 is on the word of the year, Webster's word of the year, which is authentic. And so we go into that a little bit more if you're interested in learning more about what we're talking about when we're talking about being authentic. So anyway, when we talk about defining executive presence, because I think part of how we can be helpful to people today is just in what is it? Because it feels like an enigma. And so there was an article in Harvard Business Review recently called The New Rules of Executive Presence by Sylvia Ann Hewlett. One of the things that I liked about the article, not all of it I agreed with, and I know Blonka didn't agree with all of it either, but I will say that what I thought was interesting is how she breaks it down, because so few people actually break it down into what it means. So for what it is, what she breaks it down into three main categories of gravitas, communication traits, and appearance.
Yes.
Okay. So gravitas is a mixture of confidence, decisiveness, integrity, emotional intelligence, blue chip pedigree. I'm like, what the heck is that? Vision. And then she also breaks it down into like inclusiveness. Oh, I know. Okay. So in 2012, this was the part that we found. This is okay. Let me start this over, because the way that this is important. She did when they were doing this research for this article, they did a survey with, I don't know, a couple hundred people in executive positions in 2012 and then again in 2022.
With
and
far less people.
Far less people in 2022, which is interesting, right? I hope it. So anyway, in 2012, the things that defined gravitas were confidence, decisiveness, integrity, emotional intelligence, blue chip pedigree, and vision. Okay. In 2022, the things that defined gravitas were confidence remained the same, decisiveness remained the same. Instead of integrity, inclusiveness was high up there. Respect for others, emotional intelligence didn't rank, which is interesting. I wouldn't disagree with that. Vision comes up in importance, and integrity is there but lower importance, which is interesting. Then the next, that's gravitas. Then communication traits. Basically, it came down to both sides had superior speaking skills seem to be important. That's why so many people, come really start working on their public speaking is biggest fear. I think it's bigger than death. And we get a lot of requests for public speaking help. So superior public speaking skills, command in a room, or in 22 in a Zoom room, which, slightly different. Forcefulness was in 2012, which is interesting, versus listen to learn orientation, which is 2022. Ability to read an audience was both generations. Joking and banter, right? Now that was changed out for authenticity. Isn't that interesting? And then the next was the same as use of body language. All right. So then finally, appearance traits. You want to read these ones through?
Sure. In 2012, the top was polished look, and versus polished look is still number one in 2022. The next one was physical attractiveness versus authenticity, which is interesting with appearance traits. Next one was next job style of dress. Yes, that means you're dressing for what you want to be next in your career, not just where you are right now.
Right. Dress for the job you want,
Want
not
the
the
job
job
you
you
have.
have.
Exactly. So that was in
That's
20.
how we were trained.
Yes, exactly. So that was in 2012. And now that was replaced with fitness and vigor.
Wow.
Interesting. Number three. So number four, 2012 was tallness, which is
Mm.
hilarious. Yeah. Tallness versus now new normal style of dress.
What does that mean?
I guess dress for what makes you feel good, So that's it's
Wow.
definitely more casual in nature.
Mm-hmm. You can see that in the workplaces
Yes,
too,
across the
right?
board. Number five, 2012 with youthfulness and vigor, which is interesting, versus curation of an online image.
Oh.
Yeah, which you wouldn't have in 2012 in general. So that's, a little touch and go on that one. And then my favorite one, the last one was slimness. And then versus willingness to show up in person, which is another thing that you would not have
Whoa.
had in 2012. So that's it was so interesting. What I found interesting with the article is she says the same things were on the list in 2012 that were on the list in 2022. I find it hard to believe that willingness to show up in person was a thing that people even thought about in 2012.
Right.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
everybody went to work in 2012.
Yeah, but you know where they might not have, and this is an interest, is they might not have gone to company dinners. They might not have gone to,
True.
and I still see that in some of the people that I coach, that the young people, they don't go to like their company events. And I'm like, no, you got to show up. Like that's part of how you go to these happy hours. That's how you're creating relationships. That's how you're meeting people. That's how you're someone who's willing to show up. So maybe it was that back then. I don't know, but I think more people probably did it. So fascinating.
Yeah.
I feel like back in the day, this is like the list they used for like who could be president.
Of
You know
course.
what I mean? Like, remember how they would say you have to be a certain age, and now they're old as heck. But you had to be certain age, you had to look a certain
age,
way.
slimness, that whole polished look, the physical attractiveness piece,
Of
all
your
of
wife.
That. Yes, of you, your wife, your kids, the whole kit and caboodle. Yeah,
Your dogs.
Yeah,
yeah. So it's interesting because even though some of these things people don't talk about and would never because they're HR problems all over them, people do judge people based on a lot of these things,
Easily. I mean, the saying, you only get one chance at a first impression is priceless. And that's one of the things that I have adult daughters, and I try and teach them that all the time. So the way you're dressed the first time, the way you speak to people, the way you carry yourself that first time a person meets you will go a long way. That is, they may meet you several times after that. But that first one, you kind of put yourself in a place in people's minds, and then you can move. I'm not saying that you can never move out of that place, but that holds a lot of weight. So those things, just in general, because this is the way of the world, appearance traits and speaking, your communication, are two of the biggest things that I've noticed in a room that have made people in my mind think that I have a certain kind of executive leadership or executive presence.
Yeah, because if you don't know Blonka and you haven't seen her, she's very fashionable, but in a, always appropriate to whatever the situation is, but pushes it a little bit so she's noticeable. There's something there that's different. She thinks a lot about that, but it comes off effortlessly, right? Not everybody has that skill. Most people don't, but it is a powerful thing to have, right? It's a powerful thing in your arsenal. If you happen to be good at fashion or to be good at how you dress for your body, can be really helpful and is worth taking a class in. Going on YouTube, going on TikTok. There's tons of people, including Blonka, on TikTok that will show you how she puts her outfits together. I was like, yes, finally. That you're right. And it's also, I think, is your dress style aspirational slightly?
Yes.
And also appropriate to whatever your field is, right? To your company and to your field. So for instance, I'll use your daughters, Blonka. They, one of them is in fashion, is a model. Right. She also has a job, I won't give it away, but she's, that's a different style of dress than somebody else who has a different kind of job, right? At
Right.
maybe like a bank.
Like Blake
So
was working in PR and marketing, and she met with clients all the time. So that's a different style of dress than Shay going to a fashion house and working there.
And so sometimes when you're a young person and you just think, well, this is the way I dress, people should be fine with it wherever. Yes, you're right. You are right. And if you've been told or you think that to move up in your career faster, look around to what is the field that you're in. How can you have it be slightly aspirational, slightly above? How can I add who I am, but still fit into this world and lead these people? Because the idea is that eventually, even if I don't have any sort of power or authority over people now, I want to.
Yes.
And so how do I project in everything I do that I can lead and motivate others?
Yeah. Because, I mean, as you said, it sounds very trite and that, oh, the way I dress makes the big difference about my job. Sometimes people look at it as that how you carry yourself dictates how you will do the work, good, bad, or indifferent. So even if you're not a person who's into fashion, you don't, being neat, being clean, like all of those very basic things, because you may not
Mm.
be into fashion, but if you're neat, and tidy all the time, that says, oh, to some people, oh, that they may be neat at work. They may be organized at work. That leans into that. All of those things kind of play together when it comes to executive presence, especially when it comes to the area of
Of
appearance.
appearance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you don't have money for it, you don't have to use that as an
No.
excuse because there's ways to do it with very simple things. Again, go check out Blanca's TikTok. Although you'll see lots of fun things too. Yeah, so let's just stick on appearance and then we'll move to communication and gravitas in a minute. Another one that I find, and it was interesting that tallness came up, or a lot of times as women, we are shorter in general. And that can be difficult when you're going into a room with a lot of tall men, right? There is a predisposition that we all have that tallness equals leadership of some sort, right? It probably goes back to the days of like caveman times and like protecting
Yes.
the tribe from animals or whatever. And so we're fighting against a very old brain that is used to that. And so as a woman, there are some tips that you can do, even though we cannot be taller. High heels were the first part of that process, right? So you don't have to wear high heels. And I'm not saying that. God, I'm going to get a lot of hate mail.
I never do.
Now, yeah, Blanca never does. I wear a short heel, but it does make me feel like on top of things a little bit more. But that's certainly why that started, right? Because height does create attention. It creates someone to look over at you. It doesn't mean if you're short, you can't. But like Amy Cuddy, in her book, which I highly recommend, it's called Presence, or her TED Talk, she does these power poses, right? So she does this Wonder Woman where your arms are up, and imagine like a big V, or like a cheerleader stance, like a big Wonder Woman pose, and your legs are out in a V also. So you're kind of like a big X. The other one is to have a Superman Wonder Woman pose where you have your hands on your hips really strongly, right? You can imagine her gold bracelets and then they're sitting there on her hips and again, her legs are out strong. But one of the things that I try to think about when I had to go in years ago to a deposition. Ooh, talk about something that creates a tremendous amount of anxiety and like my confidence was just waning. I was really struggling and I thought I was getting nervous. My palms were sweating. I was like, I'm not gonna be able to do this. I feel guilty, even though I'm not guilty. I feel guilty. Right, just doing it, I feel guilty, just having to talk to a judge or whatever. So I thought, I just need a minute. And I went into the bathroom and I looked myself in the mirror. I swear first I looked underneath the stalls to make sure no one was in there. And there wasn't, thank God. And then I looked myself in the mirror and I was like, you can do this. Like you've done harder things than this. You can do this. And I kind of just took a deep breath in just to focus myself and, just kind of centered for a minute, raised my arms up high. And then I remembered Amy Cuddy's TED Talk and I put myself in those power poses, right? And then I took another deep breath in and then I walked into that room like a different woman. I swear to God, because sometimes the outside can change the inside. It doesn't always have to be that you have to wait for the inside to get strong to change the outside, right? That's the long version and probably the deeper version. But for a small amount of time, I got a supersized boost of whatever it was, the power that helped me go into that room. And the lawyer that was representing me at the time, he said to me afterwards, he said, oh my God, he goes, I don't know what you did when you left the room, but when you came back in, you were fantastic. And I was like, yeah, I know. And I felt it, I really felt it. And so one of the things you can do if you're not if you don't have tallness on your side, is you can create a bigger energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And some ways you can do that with fashion. Some ways you can do that with just creating bigger space, taking up more space. So when I did that, eventually I didn't walk into the room with my arms up in power pose. But what that does is it opens up your shoulder blades, your chest comes out, you're not like hunched over, scared in an anxiety ridden pose, right? Everything comes stronger. And all of a sudden, people, when they see that, they feel more confident. They believe in you. They want to believe in you. It's psychological what's
Totally.
happening. You don't even have to talk about it. It's just, these are these like nonverbal cues that we are sending all the time. And we don't know it always, right? So if you're like this and you got your arms like this and your head's down and
Right.
you're not making eye contact, you're sending a cue. My son is very tall. He's 6 feet tall, but he would not seem like it most of the time because he would be kind of hunched over in his game playing, stance, as I call it. And he would be on the soccer field and I'd be like, because he's a soccer player, and I'd be like, I'm going to teach you something. Like, just put those shoulders back. You're going to intimidate that defender way more than you are when your shoulders are like
Mm-hmm.
this. And when you run, you're going to run faster because your body's more in alignment, And he kind of listened to me. He won't admit it. And I know he's not listening, so it's safe to say. But I did see him working on that. He doesn't always remember because it's a habit when you're used to,
Yes.
playing on your Xbox too many hours. But anyway, so it's like if you also are a game player, just remember that that's creating something that you need to change up when you're around
In a different
folks
environment,
in a
because
different
it's
environment.
fine when you're playing games with your friends, but you do need to do that stand back a little bit, and I think that's
Mm.
another one with women in heels. That's another power move. Especially, I've seen women do it all the time. It's very interesting to me because I don't wear heels anymore, but you see a woman who's standing there talking, and then when people move in, you lean back on that heel,
Mm.
and you now, because now you're moving back, and that means people move in a little bit. And so
Mm.
that's another big one for executive presence. There are a lot of little tricks that you can do, particularly as a woman, with those kinds of things. The heels are one that I always notice, because you can see women who are uncomfortable in them and they just kind of hunch over because they're like not used to doing it, and they did it just for this event. You can see the difference in those people than the women who are really used to it. And that's what I say. I don't wear heels, so you don't necessarily have to do it. You can do those exact same things, those same moves in a room to get that draw in, which is part of executive presence, getting people to feel confident in you and want more of you.
Perfect. Here's a couple other tips that are these are things no one talks about, but people do. And I've learned them from older men in my life, because they do this stuff, but it weirdly works. So the other thing in appearance or in these cues that we're setting, when you go into a room, a meeting room, like physically in a room, think about where you sit.
Oh, yeah.
Because there are power positions in the room, right? If you can sit at the heads of the table, go for it. If that is supposed to be for the boss or for whatever, obviously don't. But also don't have your back to the door. Sit opposite of the door so that you see the door, right? That's also a power position. I've seen men move because of that. Do you know what I
Without a
mean? Or
doubt.
if think about like, where can people see you, even if you're not going to speak? The other thing is, if you, as women, we've been taught for our whole lives to cross our legs, which you should do if the table can see up your skirt, for sure. But one of the things that I found in terms of taking up space in a seated position is to take more room in your chair, still standing up tall, but to uncross your legs sometimes and give yourself more space, like man spreading.
Almost, yeah.
Can work,
hmm
right? Like that idea of like, I'm bigger than I am, my energy is bigger, can be powerful. Now that's in a meeting room. In a one-on-one, very different. If
Yes.
you want to listen and I'm with Blonka, I might do what she's doing, right? I might mimic her
hmm
behavior, because that creates a sense of like camaraderie immediately. So these are just little tricks. What other little tricks that to build that? Well, we talked about appearance. Let's talk about communication skills. So what sticks out to you in communication skills?
I gotta say, everybody speaks differently. Everybody talks differently. There's accents. There's all kinds of things that impact the way people communicate. Education, all those things. Speaking confidently, normally, just speaking decisively, because that was one of the things that was on the list, I believe, like being
Mm-hmm.
decisive in what you're saying, and also being clear. Literally, try to be as clear as possible in your speech and to be decisive and know what you're saying. Doesn't matter everything else, accents, blah, 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 like all of those things. But if you are, and I got to say, loud and wrong, people say that all the time, it's strong
Strong
and
and
wrong,
wrong.
but if you believe in what you're saying and you say it in a very decisive and clear and concise manner, and then speak very clearly, it goes miles, miles and miles and miles. And then also just be willing to speak, period.
Mm,
That is
hmm.
one of the biggest things in executive presence. Now, there are people who don't say anything. That's a whole other level. That's a whole other mind game level that, that's like up here. But if
Hmm.
you're going to be in a room and you want people to take you seriously or think about you in a leadership capacity, at some point you are going to have to speak, period. And I've watched that happen, people being in a meeting and they just simply say nothing.
Yeah, so true. And especially, I think this is a generalization, but I think generally as women, we tend to do that sometimes in meetings is we want to say the exact right thing, or we think it needs to fit all this criteria that frankly men don't feel the same burden by. And so see how you can take a risk. I always do, I've talked about it before in workshops all the time. Put 3 pennies in your pocket. If you have a long meeting, think, I'm just going to be able to, can I say 3 things? Can I say one thing in this meeting? Now, if you're someone who talks too much, because that can have the other effect, then say, I'm only allowed to say 3 things in this meeting. So is this worth it? Is this going to be impactful enough to share? So use that as a little trick for yourself if you want to build that skill of talking, because I agree with you. It's important to start practicing. And the sooner you start practicing, don't wait till you're in an executive position to practice this. Practice it now when the stakes are lower, right? Practice it in a Zoom room, whatever you have to do. The other thing is your voice. Blanka has a beautiful voice, right? She has a very deep voice. People commented on it all the time. I do not. I was not born with that. That is not, not only that, I grew up with a Texas accent. You probably had more of an accent too. Blanca's from Georgia, but I learned real quick. I was, learned I don't want to sound like this. So I took lots of voice lessons, and I have to do a lot to try to lower the timbre of my voice. And before I go into a big meeting, I do a lot of vocal warm-ups. My husband thinks I'm crazy, but I'm like, yeah, you have an English accent, dude. You don't have to do anything. People listen to you right away, no matter what, right? With me, I have to get myself like, what, unique unique New York, and try to like pull that voice down, because when I'm nervous, it goes up and then it gets really high in that register, and no one likes to listen to that, So as women, we just naturally have higher voices. And so we have to work a little bit on lowering the timbre of that voice. And I know I'm going to get lots of hate mail about this. It doesn't mean you can't be yourself, but until the world catches up, these are tricks that will help you. When we get nervous, our voices rise, and you're against men who just are lucky to have deeper voices. And, it's something that we're conditioned to think of
Authoritative.
as
Yeah.
authoritative. Yeah,
I mean, that's
exactly.
just plain and
Perfect.
simple. It goes
Yeah.
along with all of it, all the things that we fight against on a regular basis as women in general.
The other thing in this area of communication is listening. And this, I think, has gotten women a lot further recently, and why women are moving up is that we tend to be better at listening. Not always, but we tend to. I will say, if you work on your listening skills, it's not something to take for granted. I was in a room with a bunch of CEOs recently working on like the basics of listening, and I was shocked at how hard it was for them. It is an active practice of how can I listen better, especially with phones, in our way. Are you someone that goes into a meeting and is distracted, or are you present? Are you there looking people in the eye, talking to them, so forth? Because as a listener, and we say this all the time, is the person listening getting the message that you intend? Is the person talking really feel like you're listening? It's not enough just to listen. And I try to talk to my same son about this all the time, because he listens, but he's not looking at you, right? And I started to note, I thought it was just me, but I started to notice it was with other adults too. And, he's of the age where he's going to need this in the workforce pretty soon. I was like, you don't understand. When someone's talking, they need you to look at them. Not always, but most of the time, because it makes them feel like you're listening to them. And that's half the battle.
Yep.
So I think when you're talking about communication skills, listening, certainly a big. Body language, same
And
thing.
they kind of go hand in hand. What I was saying earlier, when you walk into a room, loud, you might be, strong and wrong, but you have the opportunity, if you're really practicing active listening skills, listen to what people are saying. And then when you're chiming in a very, you know what you're talking about. You can pull from what they've said because you've actually been listening to what they've said, especially in a meeting. When I said you should speak in a meeting, if you're actively listening and you're speaking, you're more likely to be taken seriously because now you know what you're talking about. So I think a lot of people don't pay attention to that thing,
Mhm.
the active listening piece,
Mhm.
because as you said, we're on our phones. We're halfway through, the idea of multitasking cracks me up because that means you're just doing a lot of things poorly. And so normally when you're in a meeting, it's that way. You're half listening to what they're saying and then you're on your phone scrolling and then you look up and you're like, oh yeah, I thought that. And they're like, we weren't even talking about that anymore. And now you've done yourself a
Mhm.
disservice already. So actively listening, really paying attention, especially when you're in a one-on-one situation or a smaller situation, because then you really have the opportunity to stand out with, I listen to what you're saying, and now I'm going to ask questions about that, or now I'm going to comment on it. And it will come across very sincere if you were really listening. And it will also come across as confident and knowledgeable if you're genuinely listening.
Yeah, very, very good point. That's also goes to that ability to read the room. People will say, how do you do that? Well, the first thing is to listen and watch, right? Observe. And then once you start to do that and you can see when people are with you, when people aren't, and you need to stay on a point, when people have got it and you need to move on to a
Exactly.
point, when there's something else going on that you're not addressing. All of these things are leadership presence that we just think we have to learn by doing it, by getting there. But you can actually start practicing it now. Practice for the job that you want, right? Not the one
Exactly.
you have.
And the skills that you want, you're practicing those higher skills. Walking into a room, Christine and I were just at a conference last week. And one of the big things about executive presence, I think, is knowing how to work a room and knowing the people to tackle. That's all about listening and watching. You sit, you see who in the room is people are paying attention to, who are talking to the most, who are getting the most responses. And you're like, oh, I need to meet that person.
Hmm.
Oh, that person, I can tell people have respect for that person. Maybe I should link up with them later. It's very easy, but you have to be paying attention to those things. And then part of communication and working a room is if you know that person in that room has respect of multiple other people because you've been watching it, and then you go over there and you strike up a conversation with them and you're talking, then you also immediately become a person of importance in that room.
Yeah, who are you hanging out with? And that's a very good one. Are people see you hanging out with the folks that are bringing you down? You've heard this thing probably. You look at your five closest friends. What jobs do they have? And are they, do you need to get new friends? Not keep your old friends, that's fine, but increase your circle to have friends that have the kinds of jobs that you want because you're going to immediately start reading the rooms differently. You're going to start behaving differently. That's great. All right. And the last one is we've touched on this already a little bit, but gravitas, which is about confidence, decisiveness. We talked about that. Emotional intelligence, kind of how you respect others, kind of your vision. Those things, I think a lot of that stuff comes with practice and with just doing jobs that require decisions and so forth. But also you can practice those emotional intelligence skills, that self-awareness, that looking at it, and then making some decisions about who you want to be, how you want to be in this world. I went to, I think it was Forbes or Fortune or something, like a women's business conference years ago. And Allie Webb, who is the founder of Dry Bar. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Dry Bar most people know this, but if you don't, it's like a hair salon that's everywhere, and you can go in and they don't do haircuts, they just do blowouts where they blow your hair straight and you get some champagne or prosecco or something. They make it a nice experience, but it's kind of brilliant because they don't ever do a haircut, so it's a different level of employee that you have to hire and so forth. But anyway, so I was interested in listening to her, and she's from Texas, where I'm from. And the thing she did in her speech is she pulled up a picture of herself, in high school with her curly hair, right? Not unlike my curly hair, maybe a little bit curlier. And then she said, that she basically wanted to change that part of herself. And she tells this big story and how she never felt powerful with her curls. And, so she created this whole culture of like blowing out your curls. So of course now I was mad. So I'm in the audience and I'm thinking, oh my God, like now I hate you, Dry Bar, because I was like, why can't we embrace our curls? And I know hair is a big thing, and more so even in the Black culture. I know that, Blonka. So I'm not deaf to that. But I really it really had an impact on me. And I was like, oh my God, we have created this whole thing where in order to be a successful woman, you have to have straight hair,
Hmm.
and I just decided like, nope, I'm not going to do that. That was one of those areas where I'm like, nope, I'm not going to change that. These curls, like it or not, are part of who I am. And I'm going to live with that one. And, sometimes I got to tame them back if I'm going into a bank, but I don't really straighten it out for that purpose.
Hmm.
But that could be a hard one. Like you have to think about that. Like hair for women is different than men. Most men don't have the hair conundrum, maybe more and more today. There's different hairstyles and stuff. But I think with women, hair can be a polarizing factor, right, of what we do.
Yep.
Another thing that's interesting, my mom, who grew, who was an executive in the 80s, that would be the 1980s, she taught me something as a working woman. She said, listen, never let them see you type. And I was like, what? And she goes, my mother was a fantastic typer, right? She went to secretarial school back in in the early 60s. Was like one of the Mad Men receptionists until she went back to school later and became head of sales for a national company. But she was an amazing typist. And when she had all these sales people, mostly men, reporting to her, she would have to shut her door and to type up a memo or something that she wanted to type in her computer, because often when she didn't left it open, her sales folks would come in and to say something to her in her door, and they'd see her like and immediately their estimation of her went down. So I was like, oh my God, Mom, I don't know how to type anyway. What difference does it make, like this? Because she never wanted us to take typing lessons. Isn't that funny? Even though that would be a really good skill to have right now. In her time in the 1980s, that she noticed that was not helping with her gravitas, right? So you have to kind of look around and go, wait a minute, what are these cues that of course shouldn't be the way things are, right, but what are they? And how do I make sure that I am not pigeonholed because of something?
Yeah, I think that's looking at those kinds of things are big. And I think one of the great things that I love about this list is when you mentioned, you're like, what the heck is a blue chip pedigree?
Oh yeah.
That thing in gravitas, I love that that's gone down. And I think that's because of the whole notion that you don't have to go to college, not saying there's anything against college, and grad school and do all these things anymore, in order to be seen in a particular way. And so what you do academically doesn't necessarily have to find its way into your job description all the time anymore. I think that's where the young people have it really good right now. Like your mom could have gotten pigeonholed because she had this one particular skill set if she let people know. Now, those things aren't as big of a deal, I think, in that way, especially when it comes to like a college career or your degrees and diplomas. It's not that big of a deal whether you have one or don't have one. It's really what your skill set, all of those things, I think have pushed. And then, the advent of IT and technology with like your Bill Gateses, who didn't finish school, is one of the richest people in the world. They have that, the younger people have that plus behind them. And they just have to know that. And I think that's one of the big hurdles for them in the gravitas places. Okay, fine. I don't have to go to college. Fine. Now that's not a big deal anymore. But you have to make up for not going to college in a bunch of other ways. And that's life experience. That's learning these kinds of skills. Those things, if you had a regular college experience, you would learn a bit of those things as you were going along doing that. But now you opted out of that, totally fine. My youngest daughter didn't go to school and now has a regular, full-time job.
Well-paying too.
A well-paying full-time job. She went for a year and a half, got cut because COVID, but you have to learn those other things along the way. And so that's where she has kind of struggled at work, even working in fashion, still workplace etiquette, all of those things being seen. She's the youngest person at her job.
Mm-hmm.
And so being seen as a person who is in a leadership position, but having that leadership, presence, speaking up in meetings, giving your ideas, all of those things. We had to have a conversation about not just, she's like, well, they want me to present, but I sent them my PowerPoint, my ad campaign ideas. I don't know why they want me to present. That's showing up in person. You have to present your ideas. You have to learn how to stand in front of a crowd, present those ideas confidently, and then, let them make the judgment versus kind of sneaking it in an email. You don't get to back yourself up. And so those are the things that I think they're having to learn that are really hard for them.
That's great. And how wonderful that she has a mentor like yourself, whether she won't call you that, but
Never.
the idea is that you can also, the last tip of the day, because we've been talking we could talk about this forever, Leadership University, come here. But one of the things that you can do is find a mentor. Look at other people who you think, I'd like to be like her. I'd like to have that power in my own way, but I'd like to have that ability. And start, ask her for coffee, ask him to go out. Like, you'll get a sense of like, how do I, by being around folks like that. So, and some people even today, you can ask them to be your mentor and they will love that. The worst they can say is no. It's a good practice.
That's exactly it. And we did a podcast on that. I'm not sure the episode, but we did a podcast on mentors and coaches. So check that out if you get the chance to.
That's right.
Find out a little bit more about that, that lane in your life, especially if you're a younger person. It's very helpful. Super helpful.
Yep. That's a good episode on that too. We have more on those coming up because those are popular topics. So anyway, thank you, Blonka, for joining me today and diving into this. Hopefully we helped you guys clarify a little bit about what executive presence or leadership presence means and how you can improve yours and build that in you.
Thanks for having me, Christine.
Thanks everybody for listening. I'd like to give a special shout out to our podcast producer, Richard Francisco. Check out our notes for any details. And if you get anything out of this, please follow us. And if you enjoy it, please take a moment to rate us or write a comment. It will mean the world to us. We'd love to hear from you. And if you just can't get enough, follow me on TikTok and check out tlpnyc.com/podcast for more information.